From the Horsebox guest this month, Hugo Owen was brought up with farming, country sports, and daring tales of adventure from his uncle in the school holidays. You will be listening to how all this plays out in the life of a 30-year-old who is very much engaged with our fast-paced society, as well as someone who wants to travel to see other countries and cultures to put everything into perspective for himself. And I have to admit, to be slightly in awe of your podcast credentials, Hugo, because you've hosted 2 amazing podcasts.
Well, yeah, it's great to be here. I mean, this is the first time I've been on the other side of the room, so to speak. So this is a first for me. Hopefully it goes all well. But yeah, like you say, I've got 2 podcasts, one on hunting, which I did slightly later, and then the other one interviewing authors on great explorers throughout history. So pretty polar opposite sort of themes there. But I guess starting off with the explorer one, I think what inspired me for that was probably my childhood. I had an uncle who he lived in Australia for a lot of his time, but he also traveled the world. He left the UK when he was 20, traveled around Afghanistan and places like that. And he would always come back to Wales during the summer, and he would tell me of all these tales. And he would also tell me of the sort of tales of all these sort of Flashman-esque characters, English officers going into the Hindu Kush and things like that. And it just filled my brain with this world of excitement and adventure. And I think that sort of stayed with me throughout. I've always read a lot of books around that. In lockdown, I have another friend who's equally obsessed with this sort of stuff. And we would always talk, it's like, it would be great to do a podcast. And I'm sure like you think, well, why don't you just do it? It's amazing that you go from, the reality is, so we set it up and we created a little fancy icon for our image and got a name, A Dream and a Fear. And suddenly you start emailing authors, which in normal life, you would never have access to them. But suddenly you're this sort of podcast. And it's amazing how it just opens the door to this whole different world. And the reality is, all you are just two lads in a basement trying to interview people. So
it is a great way to explore big topics that you're absolutely fascinated with.
Yeah.
And you obviously do a lot of research. Since listening to your Dream and a Fear, I've become a bit, I can see the fascination that you have. The title of the podcast, The Dream and a Fear, is that a direct quote from The Heart of Darkness?
It is. I mean, that's very niche. So you've done your research, which is great. Yeah, it is. I think we wanted a reference from Heart of Darkness for a couple of reasons. I mean, you look at Conrad's life in general, first of all, and he was a gun runner in the Spanish Civil War. He was in the Navy for about 20 years. He nearly died twice in various shipwrecks, and then wrote his various books, Heart of Darkness being one of them, in his 3rd language. And like he is the epitome of that sense of adventure, I think. And then Heart of Darkness also captures those elements of going into the unknown. And I thought, we just thought it was a great crossover.
So the response you got from contacting the authors was really positive, was it?
It was meant to, I think once you get the first one. So, and this has always been more of a pastime for me. My day-to-day job is slightly different, but like you say, it's a great opportunity you're obsessed with something, and it's a great avenue to explore those obsessions. And that's probably what I love about it most.
I thoroughly recommend the episodes. They are fascinating subjects. And the one you've chosen is your favourite, is that very first one. Would you like to just set it in context of this Antarctic great age of exploring it centres on? Yeah,
I'd love to. It was the first one, and I think we both read the book at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think that probably spurred us on to go and do something about it. Anyway, Tom Crean, he was an Irishman born in the late 1800s. And he was the only guy. I mean, a lot of people obviously know the Scott expedition, which went to the centre of the pole. They all died. Tom Crean didn't. We'll get to that in a minute. But he was the only guy that both did Scott's Terra Nova expedition and also Shackleton a couple of years later in the Endurance. And he was front and centre of all of that. But no one knows anything about this guy. He's completely wiped out from history, apart from a biography written about 10 years ago on the character. I mean, he survived Scott's ordeal partly because Scott made the decision about 80 miles away from the pole to send 3 men back. 2 of them they were ill at the point. They were probably going to die if they went any further. So Crean, being the strongest man at the time, was told to take these men back. And he pretty much dragged them for 1,000 miles. And as a result, those men survived on his watch. We then all know what happened to Scott. They all perished before getting to the pole. But then a couple of years later, Amundsen obviously then got to the pole. So they were running out of things to do that were new. Shackleton got funding from the National Geographic Society to go and try and navigate from east to west, do the whole length of the Antarctic. Crean signed up with about 20 other men, and he was critical in the whole experience. They set off from a place called South Georgia, so at the bottom of South America. All it was at that point was a sort of whaling station with these Norwegian whalers. And they were told, do not go. It's one of the coldest winters on record. You'll get stuck too far out. Anyway, like good Brits do, they just ignored it. And they went into the Weddell Sea, and their boat effectively just got caught in the pack ice, miles out from where they thought they would get to. And rather than sort of turning back, they decided to go on. So they started the mission right from it was an extra sort of 1,000 miles. They quickly realized they didn't have the supplies. They couldn't get the food chains working. They had to eat a lot of their dogs, which they didn't intend to. They struggled to catch penguins, etc. And they got to the point where they realized if they go on, they're probably going to die. So they turned back. They got they had little boats, which were probably maybe from 10 foot to 20 foot, tiny little sails. And they realized the next place they needed to get to if they wanted to survive was this inhospitable island called Elephant Island, which was barren. There was nothing there, but it was somewhere where they could get off the pack ice. So, we're already sort of 8 months into this ordeal. So these men are going through horrific hardship to get to this point. Anyway, they managed to get to Elephant Island at the point which they realized we're either staying here till we die, or we're going to have to try and somehow get back to South Georgia, which in itself was almost 2,500 miles. And they had a small boat no larger than 20 foot. And they realized, this is bang in the middle of the First World War. So no ships are going to ever find them on here. So Shackleton decided to pick 5 men, Crean being one of them, to sail from Elephant Island all the way back to South Georgia, where they set off almost a year and a half before. In terms of greatest survival stories, I genuinely don't think that there's a rival. Maybe Blythe, I can think of, but
that was in warm waters.
Well, exactly. This is, and it wasn't after sort of being malnourished for a year and a half. Yeah. And what is amazing that they had to navigate from Elephant Island to South Georgia. And they were going around some of the toughest watercourses in the world. All they had to navigate themselves was a sextant. So it effectively takes sunlight, beams it down, and you can work out where you are in the world. And because it was overcast for the majority of the journey, they only got 3 readings, and they managed to hit South Georgia bang on from 3 nautical readings, 2,500 miles out. I just thought that was utterly incredible. And that it doesn't even, that in itself is remarkable. But they then got to South Georgia, and in order to get back to the whaling station where they started, it's now getting to like almost 2 years before, they had to climb this mountain range that up until 2005 had never been climbed again. And some American climbers climbed it in 2005 with the understanding that Shackleton had done this. And they were absolutely blown away that a man in the condition that he was in and the quality of gear that he had could have done that. And he scaled it. It took them 5 days to scale this mountain. I mean, they were so lucky. They got good weather.
There was a bit of luck involved, but even
definitely.
So, these exploits have never been surpassed, in our opinion, have they?
No, I would agree.
And this is what's so mind-blowing about it. For anyone who suddenly gets interested in this great age of Arctic exploration, I mean, it's fascinating how they lived at the edge of death the whole time. What would tempt you? I mean, you have been tempted.
I know. I don't know.
Tempt you to put yourself to the test in such a way?
I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know. I think Certainly, no, I read a lot. There's definitely a social aspect to it. I think, we see celebrities now as people who are on TikTok and things like that, which is so vapid. But back in the day, the celebrities were, to some degree, these sort of, swashbuckling generals who would go out and try and conquer these things and go into these worlds that no one had ever heard of.
I think I have read that, I think it was Shackleton who said the feeling of putting your foot down where no one else has ever.
I agree with that. And it's not something that, today, every blade of grass has been trodden on, and there's nothing out there that hasn't been exposed. And back then whether it was like Richard Burton going to Mecca, he would learn all these things and go back to London, and he would have galleries of people, listening to his every word. And I think definitely a social aspect drove those men, but also I think they were a character type that was just...
They didn't really plan to the last degree, did they? I mean, they were sort of brave beyond belief, really.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were, like you say, they ignored experts, and they were
doing it come what may.
Yeah,
they were going.
And the other one, I mean, there's so many examples to saying. I always find the accounts of Mallory, for example, just comical. So Mallory died trying to climb Everest in 19 whenever it was, and they found his body in, I think it was like 1999, and all he had were a pair of +4s on and a like knitted jumper. And the Americans who found him said that's the sort of thing you would wear in spring in Chicago, and he was wearing it sort of 2,000 meters up. And they also I saw a thing of amazing. They showed the itinerary of what these guys brought up Everest, and they had obviously all their Sherpas, but they were carrying Fortnum and Mason hampers with various things. And you think, God, these guys are in another world. They would ask him, like, why are you doing it? And he was like, I'm going there because it's there. He had no other. He didn't think of it in a more deep philosophical position. He just, because it's there, he thought that'd be cool. So
you were obviously tempted to have a go edition yourself.
Yes.
How did you plan this? Did you plan this with a lap of luxury travel, or how did you go about it yourself?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would never, just to put it on record, I'd never put myself in the same category as these people. But I mean, like we say, there's very few things that you can do that aren't, that have not already been done, which is a shame. Sometimes I wish I was born in 1800 and I could have gone out to Afghanistan and things like that. But obviously the world's different now. But I do have done a few of my own sort of trips. I cycled from Istanbul all the way to India. Took me 6 months, 10,000 K, went across 8 countries, sleeping in a tent every day. And the challenge is it's amazing how as the climate's changed, countries changed, the challenges change. Like I did it with one other guy, and we went through all the Stan countries in winter in the middle of December. And camping in that environment was horrific. I mean, there was a period of about a month where it dropped down every night to -30. And you're in your sleeping bag, horrific. And for anyone who's been to Uzbekistan, historically it was a series of khanates, so these amazing little cities, whether it's Bukhara or Khiva or Samarkand. But outside that, there's not really a lot, and it's desert. So unbelievably hot in the summer, utterly freezing in the winter.
So what was your biggest test, do you think? Did you come up against a big test?
I would probably say, I mean, there's two. I start with I would say the cold. That was unbelievably tough. And there's always a headwind if you're going east along the sort of old Silk Road. And we would cycle, I mean, as soldiers, right? Anyone who cycles will know headwinds are just soul destroying. And we would cycle for 10 hours in the -30, -20, -30, and only do about 20K. And you have nothing. So you'd stock up all your water. You'd stock up for about 7 days, knowing that you're probably not going to see anyone. We'd buy a big vat of water, put it on the back of our bikes, and within about 20 minutes it was frozen solid. So the only way to drink would be to chip ice off, put it in your stove, get your stove out, boil it, and then drink it. And it was just horrific. And then when I go into India, it was a completely different ball game, because you've got animals to deal with. I nearly got killed by an elephant as I was lying in my tent. I made the stupid mistake down in Kerala to leave all my stuff, all my food outside my tent, one being a massive pineapple. And it was the first day I was up in the mountain in the tea plantations. Suddenly the earth shaking noise. I was like, geez, what the hell is going on there? And I got my phone. I was just about dozing off. And I got my phone and unzipped my tent, turned the light on, beamed it, and all I got beaming back was this eye. And I was like, my God, what is this? And I didn't know what to do. I was in my tent. I was like, do I just keep still and hope it goes away, or do I leg it?
What would Tom Crean have done?
Tom Crean, that's a very good question. I think he would have legged it. I think he would have done. And I legged it. I literally ran underneath its trunk, and it startled it, and it's slammed into my tent. There was this fence in front of my tent. It ripped that all out. And I was like, my God. And I remember these Indians telling me, don't camp there. And I was like, I'm going to camp here. You know, they were like elephant crossing.
It was a nice spot, yeah.
And then also in India, we had the real problem of, I was on my own at this point, was in terms of the roads, it was so dangerous, particularly when you're on the main roads. And part of that reason was because I often ran out of time, so I'd to try and take the path of least resistance and go on the motorways. And as a cyclist, that's so dangerous because you have trucks coming down the other side of the road to turn right. And so they'll go in the hard shoulder where motorbikes are and cyclists. I never saw another cyclist, but anyway. And as a result, you get pushed into the main slipstreams. And
so you have more dangers.
Yeah, that's true.
Different.
And I would often say that those explorers railed. I think part of the reason, again, we're going back to the reasons, I think it was often a pushback on modernity. Certainly the later ones in the early 1900s, they often felt they had lost something in their own country, and they felt like they needed to go back to a more sort of natural state of existence. And I think that drove a lot of the later ones. But in terms of the cars, there was this one moment where this truck was going down, and there was me and a motorbike guy ahead. The motorbike guy was maybe 30 yards ahead of me, and I could see him. I realized this guy, I don't know where this guy's going to go because the truck's coming down the wrong side of the road, and there were trucks in all other lanes. So he got blocked in, and he sort of his motorbike the wheel went everywhere, and he slipped under, and this guy was run over at the waist in front of me within, it was, you must have seen that Saving Private Ryan. Have you seen that film? So about the D-Day, and there's this one moment where he pulls a body, and there's all that's left is half of his body, and this guy got cut in half in front of me.
So he was killed in front of you?
He was killed in front of me, and he was screaming. I could see I cycled past him, he was screaming at me, and I could see that when you clock eyes with someone, and it felt like his life was leaving his body at that moment, and I could not believe what I had just seen. His legs were thrown out into the road, and I was cycling past. I just could not believe what I just witnessed, and I couldn't. So I felt torn between, do I stop? But it was so dangerous. So I cycled on, and I was looking back, and all I saw was the guy who was in the truck drag the body off and throw him into a ditch. And I just thought, my God, it just shows how
you saw a glimpse of something horrific.
And how regular that probably happens in India. That's just, another one of those situations.
Clearly luck as well as leadership plays a part. What was crucial in these stories is that they had a charismatic leader who was able to mean the difference between life and death. Crean was one of them. And it seems to me that Shackleton had extraordinary leadership skills. What is it in them which is this extra quality, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what it is, and I don't know whether there's an environment during their life that creates that. I think there's certainly an element of stoicism in there. I think that certainly just the thread that runs through most of ours. It is that, and I think an ability to find, particularly when men are at their, or females or whatever, at their real, at the bottom of their energy levels, there's an ability for some men to suddenly create something out of nothing, and I think Shackleton fits into that category. But it's a hard question.
I have read that his strategies for dealing with his men are sort of emulated still today. He's dividing them up into keeping his enemies close and the troublemakers, giving them jobs, and all these different strategies that came natural to him.
Yeah, but equally, I mean, that one man during that expedition tried to mutiny really early on, and he remember, even though he cooperated, and he was one of the men who actually sailed to South Georgia, and Shackleton kept that grudge with him and didn't give him one of the medals, which all of the other men did, which I find a bit weird. Despite the fact clearly he has so many strengths, Shackleton, he still had that problem, that sort of inner bitterness.
They're not perfect, these people.
Yeah.
We're talking about them, and in a normal environment, they probably weren't particularly remarkable at all.
Yeah.
But in these scenarios,
yeah.
I mean, bravery comes in. That's another point that came to me. It comes in many forms, and this is just one of them.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about this the other day. I think, again, I'm sort of going back to that social element, but I do think people are, more than we like to admit, driven by the aim to try and be accepted by others and to be venerated by others. And I think there's a lot of, in terms of willingness to be brave in certain situations. I mean, look at medals, for example. I genuinely think in war, if you didn't have the idea of delivering medals to people who've been brave, I don't think you would see as much bravery. And I think people are driven
because it's shown, the value is shown.
Exactly. And more altruistic form of bravery is very rare. And I think if you take away the social aspects of it, it's hard to, there's very few examples of where people are brave, where it brings absolutely no benefit to themselves. I mean, it's quite a big topic, but yeah, it's something that I thought the other day. And certainly that I think, I'm not saying Tom Crean or people like that were driven by those thoughts, but I think there in terms of historic explorers, there were a lot of showmen, whether it's Lawrence of Arabia, I've said Richard Burton a few times, they were often these quite extravagant, eccentric, they liked the attention, and I think that drew that type of character.
On the theme of testing yourself and bravery is a bridge and a link to your other podcast, which you started more recently on hunting and bringing people's attention to all the positive stories and the enjoyment and the good things about it, and to celebrate those. And you made a remarkable start with that. The first episode, interviewing James Delingpole, and when he said it was like being on acid.
Oh, it was great. I mean, Delingpole was a great guy to start off with. We took him hunting as a result, and he was. I'm just turned 30, and my friends are all that age, and it was just funny having him as a sort of almost 60-year-old hanging out with us, and someone who I've listened to a lot of his podcasts throughout the years. So that was great. But I mean, I guess in terms of why we did it, I think the anecdote that I always use is I live with a guy who's field master for the Heathrow. He does the podcast with me, and he lives in London this almost double life. It takes up probably a quarter of his life. Every weekend he'll be hunting, and he has never told a single person at work that he does that. And I thought that was such a shame. I thought, this is your absolute passion, and you're not willing to talk about it. And I thought, we as a, if you want to call the hunts a sector, have been pretty bad at having a voice for ourselves. And I think that's been the case for a number of years now. And I just think we thought, I'm not saying we've achieved this, but we just thought there was definitely a platform for people just to promote, you don't have to like every aspect of hunting and you can dislike it, but at least be open-minded to understanding that it's not as black and white.
No, nothing is it? We
as this country are very good at being very aware of other people's traditions and cultures. But for whatever reason, we love to self-sabotage our own traditions, and hunting has certainly fallen foul of that. So we wanted to give a voice, and I guess no better man to do that than Delingpole.
Well, you've had a full set of fantastic guests on that, and it's been terrific. Do you feel it's hard to get feedback for podcasts, I know, but have you had any feedback from the hunting world?
We've been trolled a lot, so we definitely over-exceeded in terms of what we thought we could have done. in terms of getting people on, it's proving more difficult than we thought. I just think
You've got to be a special sort of person to cope with it, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think people in the public eye we have a cancel culture in this country. I think it's becoming less difficult in some ways, but I think certainly when you want to get people in the public eye, they're not willing to, although they might like hunting, they're not necessarily willing to die on that hill. And if it means their career being sabotaged, I think they're less likely to come on a hunting podcast.
Yeah, there are dark forces that would attack them, you mean?
Well, exactly. You need these sort of, Delling-Paul-esque characters who are above that. But you asked me the question about how it feels, whether it's like taking acid, going hunting. I would let other people decide that. But certainly, the other day I did it, and I felt like this is probably the closest to a cavalry charge. And I thought, wow, what it was good.
It does test you. I mean, this is a demanding sport.
And I genuinely think when you're on a good horse and you're flying, I don't think there's any bigger rush you can get, I would say.
Yes, I think there's a lot of fun to be had with the modern sport. You've had some terrifically funny, the Mark Prescott one was also, he is a special talker, isn't he?
I don't think there's a better...
If you want to find his episode on hunting, that's very entertaining.
He's probably the best storyteller I've ever witnessed. And we often do ours not in person. We do a couple in person, but mostly it will be through technology. And we thought we have to go and see Sir Mark. And he took us into his house, and he gave us a tour of all these rooms, and then we were able to sit down with him for an hour and just to hear some of his tales and his ability to tell a story. But
he put it all in context, didn't he?
Yeah.
It did a lot of explaining and finding common ground, because, polarization, to use a word from your earlier podcast, and we have to compromise. I
agree. And just be a bit more open-minded to things.
Absolutely.
And the more we can, the amount, in terms of feedback that we've had, the amount of people that have said, I don't necessarily, unfortunately in London, we have a situation where, there's a lot of, particularly my generation, they're very liberal. They see certain things like hunting as something that is from the dark ages, but they will have one narrative in their head, and they've never actually thought deep enough to understand the various elements that go into it. And okay, you can have your view on, the animal situation, but there are a lot of different elements to it. And I think we've had feedback being, okay, I'm people that I would never go hunting, but they said, I've listened to your podcast and it's actually made me realize that there are other elements to it, and I can actually understand why people might do it.
If you've had people saying that to you, you've done a very good job.
Yeah.
People, so well done.
It hasn't. One thing that it hasn't done though is I've had two girls that I was dating, both end it because I had a hunting podcast. So it's had a disastrous effect on my love life.
I don't know how to go with that.
I'm willing to be the martyr on this hill.
Well, you found out something about them anyway. No compromise. Have you got a favourite podcast that you would listen to?
I actually find listening to myself back horrific. I sound way posher than I think I am. So, and you're very I'm sure you might be the same. You're very self-critical of when you listen to them back. But the Sir Mark Prescott one, I think it's certainly what I'll look back on my life and think that will be one of the real, great, one of the best moments that I've had. I think it was just amazing.
I'll agree with you on that one. Now we do have a tradition at the end of quick fire questions, so let's have a go at these. Is there someone that you'd really like to on either podcast?
I would let's go. I would probably say
top of your list.
I'd love to get Jeremy Irons on, the actor. He hunts a lot. He hunts in a Afghan packle, which I find really cool. So I'd love to get him on, and we've been trying hard, and hopefully we can get somewhere with him. But he'd be great, and he'd be a great, he's retired now, so he doesn't have to worry about his career. And then on the other side, I think, as I was saying to you offline earlier, I think I sort of mythologize people who died, and modern day people, I sort of don't find them that interesting.
No.
So I'm going to say no one for that.
I find them very interesting. You see, that's my region of podcasting, is finding out about the people around me.
Yeah.
And I must be very nosy about, finding out their story. Anyway, have you any other hobbies?
In
You're
London.
quite intellectual. You like your reading and your
I do like, I should read a little bit more.
academic.
I do, yeah, but I think I let that out in podcasts. The other thing I do is I love doing mosaics, Roman mosaics. So I have to do one at the hunting field at some point.
And a quickie, tough love or TLC?
Definitely tough love, stiff upper lip.
Yeah. Which side of the microphone would you rather be, having just done this?
100% on the other side. So much
You've done really well. Hugo. Thank you very much. Oh, and very lastly, we do ask everyone for a joke or a motto.
A motto, and I think actually really fitting with the theme of today's podcast. I went to school up in Cumbria in the middle of the fells. It was pretty tough. And their motto was a stern nurse of men. And I thought that encapsulates probably Tom Crean and all that have gone before us. So I think that's a nice way to end.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Hugo, and thank you for listening. Please pass it on to your friends. And don't forget to look out for the horse box next month, when it could be you in the driving seat.